Hi, and welcome to our Vendor Excellence series where we are covering our sales and retention model. I'm so excited to be joined by Jen Hickenlooper today, who's going to be taking us through financials, staffing, analytics, and efficiency products as we leverage this model to really understand what class is predicting will happen in these segments. So as a reminder, if you haven't already taken the chance to watch our previous video that takes a moment to go through and explain this model, be sure to go and check that out. And we're just going to give you a brief explanation of how to really interpret and understand this information that we're going to be walking through today. So really the critical thing to understand is the question rank. So instead of really worrying about what the average scores are for each of the different members, we really want to take a look at where these questions fall in relationship to each other. So you'll notice that likely to recommend, that's in that top spot, which would give it a rank of 15. And then you see quality of training here, that's in that bottom slot, which gives it a rank of 1. And why does this really matter? So as we think about the ranking of these questions, the model will help us really understand the future sales and future retention for these particular vendors. So there are particular metrics with this model that we pay closer attention to that really help predict the future sales and retention for that particular vendor. So you'll see these metrics listed here, and if they fall above the rank that is listed to their right, then you'll be able to see what the predicted future average sales share or the average retention would be for that particular vendor. And as a very quick reminder, the sales share, anything over a 1 means that they're getting more than their fair share for that market. So that's what we want to pay attention to here, is that in this list of metrics, all of them will see something over that threshold of 1, which means, again, they're gaining more energy in that particular market. So with that, let's dive into our first segment. We're first going to talk about credentialing. So Jen, why don't you take us away? Let's really understand what's happening in that space and what we're predicting to happen over the next year.
Perfect. So credentialing, we have a couple vendors that are gaining a lot of traction right now. ASM and Verge Health both have high retention and sales predictions, and Simpler has really low sales retention and predictions. So one thing that we're seeing with Verge is that they're a little bit different than some of the other vendors in this market space in that they are a services-focused vendor. So though we are predicting that they have high sales, they also have a very unique model that maybe not all provider organizations would be interested in. One other interesting thing about Verge Health is they were recently purchased by RLDatix, and so it will be interesting to see what their customers think about them after this acquisition. Next, jumping in, ASM MD Staff, as you can see on the screen in front of you, is really thought of as a premier product in this market segment. Their customers are really likely to recommend them and feel like they do a good job at delivering new technology. And then our other vendor in this space that's really gaining some energy is Modio. However, they mostly play in the ambulatory space, and so we don't see them in the acute care space as much as some of the others.
Jen, that's so interesting, especially as we look at MD Staff. We know that that likely to recommend rank is so critical, one of the most important top ranks that you want to see in terms of predicting future sales. And they're sitting at that 14th rank, so just under that top spot, really showing, high future sales for that particular vendor.
So just like on our who is having the highest sales predictions, the same vendors are having the highest retention predictions. So ASM, MD Staff, Verge, and Modio Health all are really driving satisfaction for their customers and likely to retain them. Now let's move on to our next segment, which is data and analytics platforms. And this segment, we are seeing a lot of energy in. Providers really want to be able to see what is happening within their organizations. So those that are having highest sales are Innovaccer, Dimensional Insight, Health Catalyst, and Cerner. Retention is relatively high throughout this segment. Again, providers really want to be able to get into their data and see what's going on here. When we look over here, you can see that both Epic and Cerner play in this market and are both predicted to have pretty high sales. Oftentimes what we're seeing is that provider organizations are looking to them first because they already are using other products here, and so they'll look there first, and if it's good enough, they'll often go with them. However, if they're not meeting their needs, they'll start looking at an Innovaccer or Dimensional Insight or a Health Catalyst.
So I noticed here we have a large number of them that have either high sales predictions or very high sales predictions. Why is that? Are people getting more than one product? With all of these guys getting all these considerations, can you walk me through why we're seeing that?
That's a really great question. Oftentimes, they'll be choosing a vendor based on use case. And so, though many want to go with the platform approach, like I was sharing, Epic and Cerner are able to do really great with clinical data, but they may not be able to cover some of those financial use cases that people want to look into. And so, sometimes we'll see a mismatch of these vendors as well.
So interesting.
So in this market segment, something else that we're seeing is really interesting when we are predicting retention is that most of these vendors have very high or high retention. And again, this just really speaks to both how well vendors are performing in this market segment. As you can see, their performance scores are all fairly high, most of them performing in the 80s and 90s, and have a high likely to recommend rank.
All right, so next we're going to look at the data visualization and reporting segment. And something interesting in this space as we're looking at these predictions is that you're seeing some vendors that have a really high rank for some really critical metrics and then a dramatically low rank for some other really important metrics that would help predict their future sales and retention. So I'd love to dig in here, especially with these kind of cross-industry vendors and understanding how to best serve healthcare. So walk me through what we're seeing in this space.
So to start out, Tableau right now, we're seeing that they have the highest potential for growth and that they also are highly likely to retain their customers. Qlik, however, we're seeing pretty low sales and retention for both of them. When we delve into the data, some interesting things that we're seeing here is that Tableau has a really high likely to recommend score. However, when we look at that executive involvement rank, it's really low. Oftentimes what we are seeing with Tableau in the marketplace is that they're being put in different departments. And so they may not be getting that guidance so much as a larger platform solution would be getting. One thing to note that you also may notice when looking at this chart is that Microsoft Power BI is not on this chart. They actually, though fully rated on our website, did not get enough of their customers who felt they could rate executive involvement to be able to be put into our predictive model, though we are seeing some energy with them in the market.
Interesting. So in terms of retention, who are we predicting high retention with among these vendors?
Perfect. So when we look at retention, Tableau is having really high retention. They, again, have a really highly likely to recommend score and are having high overall performance. Syntellis also has a really high retention rate, and Qlik is where we're seeing that low retention rate. When we're looking at customers, people are just not looking at Qlik so much anymore in the marketplace and are often going with the Tableau or Power BI solutions.
Interesting. All right, let's take a look at our next segment. All right, in our next segment, we're going to be taking a look at financial business decision support. And in this space, it looks like there's no one in particular that really has runaway, future sales predictions. Walk me through what we're seeing in this space.
The vendor that we're seeing positioned right now is having the most sales in retention is Strata Decision Technology. However, what we're also seeing in this market is that there's a low delivery of new technology rankings across all of these products. So when we look here, again, you note that the delivery of new technology scores are 1s and 2s. This isn't the most innovative technology that we have. That we're measuring.
So interesting about that particular metric is it's really hard to score delivery of new technology really high. It's just a hard metric to have that be one of your top ranking ones. So, anything over, rank of a 6 would be something great. But with seeing those in the 1s and 2s, that's really a space where there's not a lot of kind of connected vision between the vendors and the customers. And that makes it hard for them to really look forward as well in terms of what's coming down the pike.
For sure. And then let's jump over to retention really quick. What you can see here is, again, Strata Decision Technology has a really high likely to recommend score, and their integration is also doing pretty well compared to the other vendors in this market space.
Interesting. All right, let's take a look at our next segment. So now we're going to be diving into enterprise resource planning, and this is an area that has seen a lot of energy over the last few years. And obviously today we have the leader of the space over the last couple of years has been Workday. Is the model predicting that Workday will continue to have the highest sales and retention, or is anything shaking up here?
So when we look in this segment, we're actually seeing that Workday, Infor, and Oracle have really high energy in this market space, not just Workday. And a lot of that could be placed on that they all have these integrated cloud ERP solutions that go across all of the different pillars: supply chain, financial, human resource management. And that's really having provider organizations look at upgrading their system that they're currently in. When we look at that predictive model, you can see that the delivery of new technology on Workday, Infor, and Oracle is all rated quite high, with Oracle actually being rated the highest, which is really interesting.
And what are we predicting when it comes to retention for these vendors?
So when we look at the retention, what we're seeing is Workday is having really high retention, which is not surprising to me. Their customers are usually very highly to recommend them, as you can see from their likely to recommend score. And then Infor and Oracle are also rated pretty high here as well.
Great.
And then as you can see, we do have Simpler rated on here as well. There are a few different products along with like Premier, who is not on here, but they often have lower retention because they don't have a full suite of ERP products.
Awesome. Let's move on to our next segment. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at the artificial intelligence space, particularly the data science solutions in the AI world. And obviously, this is an area that has a lot of energy, a lot of excitement, and really different expectations of different vendors and the ways that they're using them. So what is KLAS really predicting when it comes to the vendors in this space in terms of their future sales and retention?
So what we're seeing in this market segment is that closed loop AI is really having higher performance than all of the other vendors in this market. And so that really is helping drive both their sales predictions and their retention predictions. We also have both EMR vendors, Epic and Cerner, playing in this market. And again, like in the data analytics space, providers are often looking to them as a first choice. And then Javion, we have some interesting information on as well. So let's dive into the numbers a little bit here. So as you can see, like we just mentioned, closed loop AI, both performing well and has a very high likely to recommend score and executive involvement score. They do a really great job at really trying to guide their customers, is what we hear. And then both Epic and Cerner are doing pretty well. You can see that Epic, however, has a much higher likely to recommend rank than Cerner. However, Cerner's executive involvement rank is significantly higher. Javion, who used to be what we would consider like one of the highest and fastest growing vendors, has actually seen a drop off. And some of that has to do with the likely to recommend and the money's worth predictions that we're seeing here.
So interesting. So when it comes to retention, how likely will these vendors be to really hold on to their customers?
So Epic and Cerner, I think, just because they are the EMR vendors, providers are often turning to them and unlikely to leave them. And then with closed loop AI, we're also seeing pretty high retention. The model, though, is showing that Cerner is lower retention based on the metrics that we're seeing, but what we typically see in the market with them is providers do just stick with their solution.
That is interesting, because one thing this model doesn't necessarily take into consideration is some of those outside forces, like is it an enterprise solution, and some of those different variables of what types of functionality they're offering. Really this is based on where the ranks fall of their metrics, but there could be other forces that would disrupt what the model is predicting.
Correct. And one other interesting thing about this market segment is that we are missing a bunch of newer vendors because it is so new. So like Health Catalyst and Kensei and a few others that we're not actually getting any predictions on because we don't have enough data, but we are seeing them in the market, and I would expect that they'll continue to gain traction.
So interesting. All right, next we're going to take a look at the healthcare safety risk and compliance management space. So Jen, what is Class predicting when it comes to sales and retention for these vendors?
So what our prediction is that the sales energy is lower than in many market segments. However, in this market segment, because of the pandemic, we're actually seeing quite a bit of energy and organizations wanting to really refine what they are doing in here. When we look at vendors, Risk Connect has really high sales energy. If we look at their likely to recommend, it is rated high along with the integration that they're providing for their customers. One interesting thing to note in this market segment is when we're looking at Verge and RLDatix, these are actually a suite of a lot of different solutions. So though RLDatix, we're predicting average sales, this is also including 3 or 4 different products in this model. And RLDatix also bought Verge, which is a good thing to know. Origami, we're also starting to see some energy, which is a little bit different than the low sales prediction that we are seeing on here.
Why do you think that is in terms of the difference between what we're actually seeing in terms of the energy they have versus what we're seeing in the model?
So I think as you can see in this model, they're likely to recommend and their executive involvement are rated fairly high. The supports integration score is rated low. However, it is rated higher than many of the other solutions in the market when we look at it on an overall rank. And so I think that often we are having providers look to them because they don't necessarily have poor integration, it's just rated lower.
Gotcha. So in relationship with their other scores, their integration score is one of the lower ranks, but in comparison to their competitors, it is still, they're providing strong integration for their customers.
Yep, that's correct.
Gotcha.
So, and then when we look at retention, this one is fairly interesting. So Origami, Verge, and Risk Connect all are having high predicted retention from our model. However, Conduent and RLDatix are having less. When we look at the delivery of new technology, you can see that Conduent is really not delivering on that new technology based on their rankings with their customers, and that can be a frustration for them.
Interesting. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at one of our scheduling spaces, specifically the nurse and staff scheduling space. So walk me through what we're seeing in this segment.
Perfect. So the sales energy and retention predictions are fairly low in this market segment. UKG, while scoring the lowest in the segment, is seen as the most innovative for delivering new technology. So when we go and look at our rankings, you can see that they have the highest sales prediction because of this. And then also if you notice, you can see that QGenda also has a really high likely to recommend compared to others in the market. When looking at this market segment, QGenda, when we look at them, has the highest retention. They have both the highest performance and likely to recommend score, and are just really leading the market there.
Interesting. Okay, in the next segment, we're going to take a look at physician scheduling specifically. So Jen, what are we seeing in this space?
So what we're really seeing here is that this market segment as a whole has a really high forecasted overall satisfaction, along with integration and delivery of new technology being low, which is really leading to like average sales. However, it is also leading to a high retention prediction. So when we look at the actual vendors playing in this space, as you can see, most of them are average sales. Amion is a lot lower than others, and you can see that their delivery of new technology rank is really low compared to others in the market, and also their likelihood to recommend. When we shift over and look at retention, you can see that QGenda, Perfect Serve are all performing with really high retention. They have high overall performance scores and also high likely to recommend scores when we're looking at the prediction model compared to Amion, who we're seeing significantly lower in all of those metrics.
Yeah, it looks like this is a space where there's really high likely to recommend ranks, especially among those vendors that are seeing high retention. And also that forecasted overall satisfaction, having that be so high for a lot of them, high optimism among those customers. All right, in the next space, we're going to take a look at talent management. So what is Class predicting in terms of the future sales and retention for these vendors?
So what we're really seeing here is that Workday and Healthcare Source have really high scores, but Workday is having a higher sales potential, often due to their really strong integration scores that we're seeing. And both of these vendors have high overall satisfaction ratings. So when we look at this, you can see, again, Workday is having that very high score here. Another market piece that may be playing into this is also that they have a broader suite, like we were talking about earlier, that they have an ERP solution, whereas Healthcare Source, we don't really see them having a broad ERP solution. So that integration, when we look at the supports integration ranking, Workday is scoring significantly higher there.
And what does it look like when it comes to retention?
So when we look at retention, both products are having pretty high retention. And when we really look at that likely to recommend, both are scoring well there, along with that forecasted overall satisfaction.
Okay. Next, we're going to take a look at the time and attendance segment. So Jen, walk me through what we're seeing here.
Perfect. So when we look at time and attendance, UKG is really being seen as innovative and has strong likely to recommend ratings along with integration ratings. And Simpler is also having a really high prediction for sales because of their high likely to recommend and integration and customers feeling like they're getting their money's worth. So when we look into that a little bit closer, as you can see here, both of their likely to recommend scores are really high along with their integration scores. Something interesting to note is that Simpler has a significantly lower delivery of new technology ranking. And then when we switch over to the retention predictions, UKG has a much higher prediction for their retention. As you can see, their delivery of new technology rank is significantly higher than Simpler. And they also have a higher ranking for integration and their forecasted overall satisfaction.
Interesting. All right, the next section that we're going to take a look at is speech recognition, specifically the front end EMR. So walk me through what we're seeing in this space.
Perfect. So this is a really high performing market segment where most are performing in the high 80s and 90s, and Dolby has the highest score. However, their likely to recommend is a little bit lower than Nuance and 3M, which is really leading to this sales prediction of Nuance and 3M having higher sales than Dolby. As you can see, that likelihood to recommend on those is swapped. Another thing to note here is that Nuance and 3M are often chosen for their broad suite of solutions, and so that could also be playing into them being chosen. When we go to retention, Nuance and 3M also have very high retention compared to Dolby. Again, it's really going back to that likely to recommend score that's really making that difference, because across the board, they all are really integrating pretty well and they have high overall satisfaction.
So interesting. We have 2 segments left.
Yes.
I believe. Okay. In our second to last segment, we're going to take a look at patient flow. So Jen, what is happening in this space?
So when we look at patient flow, we have a lot of different vendors playing in here. Teletracking, Epic, HealthStream, and there's a lot of changing and shakeups with some acquisitions and mergers happening. We don't have all of them, again, the vendors in this space, due to some of them having low counts, so we weren't able to include them in our predictive model. But Epic, we're seeing as having very high sales. As you can see, they're rated 14 for likely to recommend and 15 on that integration. And that integration with all the other Epic suites is one reason they're really being chosen compared to others in the market. When we look at retention, again, Epic has very high retention with their customers. They have good integration, overall satisfaction. Teletracking, we're also seeing high retention from. They have a high likely to recommend rating along with overall satisfaction, and are often seen as one of the more innovative patient flow vendors in the market from what we hear from their customers.
So interesting. In our last segment, we're going to take a look at RTLS, so real-time location systems. So Jen, what's really happening in this space, and what is Class predicting that we'll see over the next year?
So we're seeing a little bit lower sales energy in this space, often due to lower likely to recommend scores, a lack of innovation, and less executive involvement. So when we look at the different vendors in this space, you can see that most of them are having average to low sales. And that executive involvement column and the delivery of new technology column, you can see are all fairly low compared to some of the other segments we've looked at today.
And how does it look when we look at the retention?
So when we look at retention, Satani is really standing out, and that is mostly due to the high forecasted overall satisfaction that you're seeing and the integration that you're seeing with their product.
This has been so fascinating. Jen, thank you so much for joining us in our Vendor Excellence series as we took a look at our sales and retention model. If you have any additional questions about the vendors that we spoke about today or want to dig further into your data, please feel free to reach out to your class representative.